Good morning. I was wondering if you've ever watched a movie and you had to just pause it right at the most exciting part. Or if you've been reading a book and you had to stop just before you found out what happened. Our story last week was a little bit like that. We had to pause it right at one of the most exciting parts. Today, our story is called Joseph Reveals Himself to His Brothers. Last week, Joseph had planted his silver cup in Benjamin's sack, and then he accused Benjamin of stealing it, even though he hadn't stolen it, and he was going to make a slave out of Benjamin. But Judah, his brother, stood up for him and said, "Please, let me take the place of Benjamin, because our father will die of a broken heart if Benjamin doesn't return to him." Well, Joseph had just reached the point where he could not keep back any longer who he was. And so he told his servants to leave the room. He wanted everybody to leave the room. He wanted privacy. Joseph wanted privacy when he was going to reveal himself to his brothers. He didn't want the servants there, but he also didn't want the servants there because he didn't want them to know about all the bad things that his brothers had done to him in the past, because Joseph had forgiven them. And when we forgive someone, we don't tell everybody else all of the things that they have done to us. Now, when the servants had gone and Joseph was left alone, the Bible tells us that he wept loudly. He just couldn't help himself. In fact, he wept so loudly that all the servants outside could hear him. And they said to the Pharaoh, "Something is going on in there. We don't know what." And then Joseph turned around and he said to his brothers, "I am Joseph, your brother." Well, when he said that, his brothers were terrified. The Bible tells us that they tried to speak and no words came out. How could this be Joseph? How could this be Joseph? And Joseph said, "Is my father still alive?" He said, "Come near. Don't be afraid, and don't be angry with yourselves for what you did to me in the past. You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. He sent me ahead of you here to Egypt to save not just your lives, but the lives of everybody who's been affected by the famine." God can do that. God can take the worst things in our lives that people have done to us, or even things that are our own fault. God can take them and make something good out of them, and this is what is happening here. But the brothers were still afraid, and Joseph said, "Come close." And they came close, and Joseph hugged each one, and he wept over each brother. And then they started to talk freely among themselves. They just couldn't believe it. Joseph alive. Joseph, the ruler of Egypt. And here he is. Every brother came forward. Nobody was afraid any longer. Isn't it wonderful? Meeting again after all these years and all this trouble. And Joseph has forgiven them because God has helped Joseph to forgive. Now, suddenly the brothers thought, "Oh no, now what are we going to tell Jacob?" Because when Jacob finds out that we threw Joseph into a pit, and that we sold him to the Ishmaelites, and that we dipped his coat in blood and lied to him about what happened to Joseph, now what's going to happen to us? But Joseph knew that, and he knew what they were afraid of, and he said, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid." He said, "I'll tell you what to tell Jacob." Now, remember I told you that those servants had heard Joseph crying? And Joseph came out and he said to them, "My brothers are here." And so word quickly spread back to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh found out that his brothers were here. And he said to Joseph, "Listen, you take carts, tell your brothers to take carts and wagons and anything else they need down to Hebron where your father is, and you tell them to bring themselves all back to Egypt, and I'll settle them all here in Egypt in the best land. Just do it." And so they did. And as they went on their way, Joseph gave each brother a new set of clothes, but he gave to Benjamin 5 sets of clothes plus 300 shekels. And he sent 10 male donkeys to Jacob, and they had the finest products of Egypt on them. He sent 10 female donkeys, and on them he put the best grains and bread and all kinds of other provisions that they would need for coming back to Egypt. So they went on their way. Now, when they came home and said to Jacob, Joseph is alive, the Bible tells us that Jacob's heart went numb. It just went like frozen. What? He didn't believe them. Joseph is alive? That's not possible. It's been 22 years since Joseph has been gone. But they said it's true. Joseph is the ruler of Egypt, and look, come and look at all these things he has sent down. Donkeys full of things, carts and wagons. He wants us all to come back, and he's going to settle us in Egypt and look after us. Well, after Jacob had a look at all of the things that they had brought, then the brothers told Jacob exactly what Joseph had told them to tell him. They described everything they had seen and all that God had done for Joseph, and so Jacob finally believed. Now when they got ready to go, this is where they had to go. They're going from Hebron down through Beersheba all the way over here to Goshen, which is the best part of Egypt. That's where Joseph had told them to go. So they packed up everything. They had camels, they had livestock, they had flocks, of course they had people. And you can see that Jacob, he's the patriarch. That means he's the head of this whole family, so he gets to ride in that little caravan there. They made their way slowly to Egypt. But this was going to be a long journey. It was going to take more than 10 days this time because they had so much stuff. Now, when they got to Beersheba, which wasn't too far down the road, Jacob wanted to stop for the night, because he wanted to offer a sacrifice to God and call on the name of the Lord. Because this is the same place, Beersheba, where God had met with Isaac and where God had met with Abraham. And so Jacob made a sacrifice to God. And in the night, God appeared to Jacob in a dream, and this is what he said. He said, I am the God of your father. He said, I'm the God of Isaac, the God of your grandfather Abraham. He said, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. He said, there I will make a great nation out of you. He said, I will go with you. And he said, Joseph will be with you when you die eventually. And so Jacob was reassured. In the Old Testament, which is where all of our stories in Genesis are found, God spoke to people in dreams and in visions. And then later God spoke through prophets who were special men of God that God had appointed. And he would tell the prophets what he wanted to say to the people. But God doesn't speak to us like that anymore. He speaks to us through the Bible. The Bible has all the words of God in here, and they're all true. God has told us everything he wants us to know about himself, about life. God has something to say about everything. But back then, God had not given the Bible yet. And so God had to speak to them through dreams and visions and then prophets. Now let's look at Jacob's dream. Remember how God said, don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. He said, I will go with you. Promises like that weren't just for Jacob. God promises us the same things. In the book of Hebrews, God says, I will never leave you or forsake you. That's a promise for us. And in the book of Psalms, it says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will guide you with my eye. That's a promise for us. So when we pray, when we talk to God, God reassures us. We've got God's promises to depend on. Isn't that wonderful? Now, when they got close to Egypt, Jacob didn't know where they were going. So he sent Judah on ahead and he said, get some directions from Joseph. Like, where are we supposed to go? And so Joseph gave Judah directions, and it was to Goshen. Now, Goshen was the most beautiful land in Egypt. It was the best land. And so they went there and they settled there. And then when Joseph heard that they were there, he got his chariot and he rode out as fast as he could. I mean, I'm sure he was racing his chariot, and his heart would have been beating fast. And the Bible tells us that when finally Joseph and Jacob met, they hugged each other and they wept for a long time. God was so good to bring them back together. Now, Joseph said to his brothers, listen, when I take you in to meet the Pharaoh, you're to tell them that you've brought with you all of your flocks and all of your livestock, all of your possessions. And when the Pharaoh asks you what your occupation is, you are to tell him that you've been shepherds all your lives. All your lives you've looked after flocks and livestock. Because, he said, the Egyptians, they don't like shepherds. And so if he knows that you're shepherds, he'll let you stay in the land of Goshen. And so that's exactly what they did. Pharaoh asked them, and they told them, and Pharaoh was pleased to let them settle in the land of Goshen. And then Joseph introduced Jacob to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh asked Jacob, well, how old are you? Jacob said, I am 130 years old. But he said, my life has been very difficult, and I'm not even as old yet as my father Isaac, my grandfather Abraham. And then, the Pharaoh was so pleased to meet Jacob, and Jacob blessed the Pharaoh. It's kind of like he prayed for him and blessed him. And so then Joseph made sure that they are all settled in the land of Goshen. Joseph was the one who made sure that each family of Jacob's, all of his brothers, all of their families were provided for. He made sure each one had enough for their own family. And Joseph, when he was sold by his brothers, he was 17 years old. And so that means that Jacob had looked after Joseph for 17 years. And after Jacob got to Egypt, he lived for 17 more years. So Joseph then looked after Jacob for 17 years. Isn't that neat? So what I want you to remember from today's story is that God can take the worst possible situations and turn them into something good. Okay, see you next time.